Hello, friends, and welcome to a special Sunday Chabura public shiur. Tonight is the final shiur of the year before we go on break, and it is an honor to have with us, closing off the season, our Rosh Bet Midrash, Rabbi Joseph Dweck, Senior Rabbi of the S&P Communities of the UK. As you all know, during the past few weeks, the Chabura has published 3 new books as part of our Musar series, Mivchar Peninim, Tzadi Hayagon, and Yesod Haida. And if you have not yet, I highly recommend all getting a copy for themselves. It's available on our website or on Amazon. During this short break that we're going to be taking, we at the Chabura are going to be working very hard, finalizing our curriculum for the next season, as well as other very exciting projects which are in the pipeline. It was an honor learning together with everyone this year, and I'm looking forward to continue growing together next year. With that said, thank you so much, everyone, for being here live. Thank you, everyone who's going to be listening afterwards. And Rabbi, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Rav Ohad. And I have to say, before I begin, that I'm thrilled that we've completed another season of our limudim in the Chabura, and it's been a wonderful season at that. I want to thank everybody that's involved. Certainly, I want to thank you, Rav Ohad, because I know that you're very, very engaged in making sure that the logistics run well, and we have so many people that are involved in trying to make sure that the Chabura runs, not only smoothly, but with proper quality and depth. And of course, we would be remiss not to recognize Rav Sina Kain and all of his work and organization. But there are so many people that are involved and volunteering and giving of their own heart in order to be able to make sure that this wonderful virtual Bet Midrash is flourishing. And flourishing it is. Flourishing it is, Baruch Hashem. So that's a wonderful thing to experience and to see and to be part of. And I just want to give bracha to everybody on their involvement, on their learning, and everything that's happening with regards to the Chabura. And B'ezrat Hashem, it should be able to continue to go mechayil al-chayil, and it should be zochet to be lomed Torah lishma, lilmod ulamed, lishmor v'la'asot, lir'a u'lahava et shem kodsho. So Sina asked me, what are we going to do for our last our closing shiur? And I always like, when he asks me to kind of set the opening closing shiur, to set a theme of some sort. And the closing shiur, of course, we're not going to set a theme because we're closing, but it's kind of closing thoughts, right? What might we take with us into the time away that we are having? I think one of the first shiurim that I gave in closing was simply, what is the meaning of time away, right? Why is it important to have time away? And we learned about that. But I think what I'd like to end with this season is a very, I think, fundamental issue. It's a fundamental question, and it is fundamental to our lives, but it is also deeply important given our current, the current milieu, or the current, context or culture of thought in which we find ourselves, mainly in the West, but it is predominant, right? The West is quite dominant in the way that it thinks, and that is that. Well, I think I'd like to say before I dive into it is, which I say very often in my shiurim, is that, look, in 45 minutes, there's going to be a limit to the depth that we can reach in terms of what it is that we're discussing. So I'm always kind of presenting broad strokes. What I will do is I will suggest further reading, further listening, further exploration and resource in order to be able to kind of further unpack these things, which are that these things lend themselves to a great deal of unpacking and constant engagement discovery. As we're going to see, it's the very nature of the entity. But what I would like to recognize is that what I'm going to present here, hopefully with the help of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, because this is not easy stuff to talk about, is the shape of these things. Right? In other words, the basic kind of outlines and silhouette of these things. So that I hope that what you will come away with after this shiur is a sense of the issue. Yeah, is a sense of the issue that I'm presenting. And a sense of an approach to dealing with the issue. That's what I would hope that we would be able to come out of this with. And hopes are hopes. I hope that, it actually can come to that. So the title of the shiur is The Edge of Reason. And the reason that I want to kind of address that is because I find that both in our Bet Midrash proper, in our Bet Midrash itself, and in the world at large, we are, in a sense, encumbered by reason. And so I call this shiur the edge of reason because I think that reason is limited, and we need to recognize its limits and recognize what we are to do with the realm that lies beyond its limits. And the first thing that I think is important to point out is that there is a tendency to believe, certainly in the Western world, that anything that lies outside of reason is how should I say, negligible in its value and importance, if at all true. Right? So before I go on, what do I mean when I say reason? Right? I mean, it's a nice term, but what is it? What is the actual, what am I talking about when I say it? Well, when we talk about reason, we are usually talking about the ability to be able to examine facts and to be able to recognize the causality of interaction with regards to those facts and come to conclusions that are hard-clad or ironclad as a result of the truth of those facts, right? So we call that one way to refer to that as deductive reasoning, right? The reason that is deductive. And what that simply means is that I have a certain premise of truths, right? Or several premises that are true that I recognize play into each other, and that if I recognize that all of them are true, there must be a conclusion that I arrive at that is hard and fast and ironclad. Yeah. So if I say, you know, all humans are mortal, and Max is human, Max is mortal. Right? That's deductive reasoning, right? I have some things that I recognize, that some premises that I recognize are true. I look at the set that that bear these elements, and I recognize a certain reasoning deduction that comes as a result of recognizing those truths. And so much, and that essentially is very much how logic works, right? It uses deductive reasoning. And so we think about when I'm talking about reason, right? I'm essentially talking about logical reasoning, right? That will usually use deductive reasoning in order for it to be able to come to its conclusions. Now, that is predominantly the way that Western thought and philosophy runs. Now, I'm using that again very broadly, but it has very much been the way that the Western mind has developed. I refer you to a wonderful book by Richard Tarnas. I think it's called The Passion of the Western Mind. If I'm not, is it The Passion of the Western Mind? I would have got. I'm not sure if it is. Oh, yeah, I'll look at it before I end. I'll get it before I end, and we'll look at it. But nonetheless, it's a phenomenal book, and it's not a small book. It's a nice and thick book, but it shows the development of Western thought and what are the kind of the key elements of Western thought. But Western thought is very much an either or kind of thinking, right? It's not comfortable with paradox. It's not comfortable with opposites being true. It's not comfortable with contradictions. Ultimately, what it aims to do is to resolve contradictions, right? So you want to come to a true deduction that cannot be questioned, right? That is provable and cannot be questioned. And those are the things that, we kind of feel very comfortable with because, we can recognize two plus two equals four can be proven. And I recognize that, there's no question about the truth of that statement. And the problem with that is that we, as a result of marrying reason, find ourselves excluded from a true experience, interaction, and understanding of so much of the nature of reality, right? So one of the things that occurs as a result of our marrying of reason and our dedication to it is that we become reductionist about it, right? So I'm going to speak a little bit more about that in time, but I'm going to throw that in there. We become reductionist about it. In what sense, right? When we find elements in reality that are very difficult to describe or grasp using reason, we tend to focus on the elements that we can deal with using reason. And they are often reduced elements, right? So if I can, talk about the fact that I recognize there are certain chemicals that fire in the brain when I am experiencing what I will call joy, and I can see that there's some element of corollary, right? I mean, every time that a person kind of describes that they're feeling joy, I can notice that these particular neurons are firing, these chemicals are present in the brain, and I can fairly confidently say that this chemical or these neurons in this area of the brain is connected to this experience that the person has. But unfortunately, it does not often provide explanation for the entirety of the phenomenon, right? Now, there's the entirety of the experience. So when I talk about love, for example, and this is a notorious example, but when I talk about love, I mean, I can certainly talk about, oxytocin firing, chemicals of oxytocin in the brain. I can talk about certain neurons firing. But I am not really describing the entirety that is love. As a matter of fact, for anybody who has been in love or anyone who has experienced love, it's extremely difficult to be able to reduce it into some constituent components and be able to truly grasp it and understand it, if at all it can be grasped and fully understood. And there is a tendency to be able to live in the reductions, right? When I say a tendency, I say in the West, there's a tendency to be able to live in the reductions. And so as a result of our comfort and security in the truths that we find using reason, we wish to be able to extend it to pretty much everything that it is that we know in the world. Now, when I say we, I don't mean necessarily you and I, but there is no question about the fact that we are in a scientific world which we live in, which is wonderful, right? It's excellent because it helps us to really understand so many things that can be deduced using reason. But in a scientific world, we tend to use its lens to view elements of reality that really have no business being seen or viewed through that lens, meaning that we are using the wrong mechanism in order to be able to truly grasp the nature of these things. So that's the premise, right? That's the idea, and that's why I'm calling this shiur the edge of reason. Yeah. The question is, what are the alternatives? I mean, what else do we really have in order to be able to, assess the nature of the world? Well, we have other ways of being able to assess it. The problem is that they do not necessarily yield the truths in the way that deductive reasoning does, right? The nature of trying to grasp something like love, or for that matter, consciousness itself, or for that matter, awe. When we talk about that, the simple experience of awe in something, or for that matter, beauty. Yeah, when I listen to a piece of music, or I see a piece of art, or I read some element of literature or poetry, and I am moved by it to a degree that is difficult to explain. In other words, I don't have the premises that I normally would have in deductive reasoning, where I can say A cause B cause C, and if A cause B cause C, then I recognize C as being connected to A in this way, and then I can essentially reproduce it if I know its ingredients and its components, and I have it, I understand it. But with these kinds of things, they simply don't work that way. Right? How am I supposed to describe beauty? How am I supposed to recreate it in perfect sense? And for that matter, even if I do create something of beauty, how am I to know how it is that it's going to affect the people who see it and experience it? These things, one might say, are perhaps too complex to be able to ultimately deal with in reason. And I think it's important to be able to discuss the difference between complexity and something that is complicated, right? There's a difference between something that is complicated and something that is complex, which I'll come back to in a moment. But how am I supposed to use it or put it together in a way that perhaps we could say is mechanistic, right? Mechanisms or machines are very much causal in their nature, right? You have various components that work together. You can map out how these things work together. You can draw blueprints for them. You can essentially describe the causality of them, even if they may very well be tremendously complicated, right? Meaning they may have very many modules to them that works, like a jet plane, it has many modules to it in order for it to be able to, or a jet fighter for that matter, many modules to it in order for it to be able to function appropriately. It's a complicated machine, but it is a machine nonetheless. We can recognize the causality of it. We understand every component of how it is that it works. We can put it together, take it apart, put it together, take it apart, turn it on, turn it off, over and over and over again, and it will always end up coming out in the same way. As we can produce hundreds of them, thousands of them, if we have the resources to be able to do so, and they will all work in surefire, right? Unless there's something unseen that we haven't recognized in terms of its construction. But otherwise, if we know everything that's there and we've put it all together appropriately, it functions. Now you take a jet fighter and compare it to a fly, and you wonder, can I turn a fly on and off? Can I shut down the power of a fly and get it back on, up and running after a certain period of time in the same way that it worked, that I can with a jet plane? And, forget about that. How do I kind of explain the intelligence of a fly that clearly I recognize it has in a very different way than a jet plane does? Because of its capacity to respond to realities in real time in ways that are not necessarily programmed into it in the way that it would be programmed into a machine. For that matter, how about the aerodynamics of a fly? Have we ever produced anything remotely close to such a thing? And is it just getting the mechanics down? Or is there something more about a fly that just is not mechanistic in its nature, that is more complex, not just complicated, right? That there are elements within that organism that are multifaceted to a point that they are simply not causal one to the next, and that there's something more there. So when I come into experiences of these kinds of things, reason alone fails me. Because as much as we would like to talk about the biology of a fly and use reason in order to be able to explain it, I will be leaving out whole swaths of its reality in the description that I make, using only the reduced reduced deductionist mechanistic descriptions of its entity. And so one of the worst things we can do is to describe organisms, for example, as glorified machines. They're not machines, and they don't function like machines. And one of the major elements of them not functioning like machines is that they are not mechanistic. Not even on the cellular level, they're not mechanistic. You talk about the genome, right? We've mapped the entire genome. Does the genome, in its information, describe life? Does it give instructions for life? Of course not. Of course not. I saw this detail. I heard this detail, unbelievable detail. I have to look at it because it's not in my area of expertise, but this is something that I read about the nature of the development of the brain, which is shocking. Shocking. Where is it? Let me find it for you. Yeah. The human brain in utero develops 4,000 new neurons every second. Every second. And then you think about the complexity of the structure of the human brain and how important the placement of those neurons are, and that in and of itself is not mapped directly and clearly in the genome. So, there is a level, and that's the difference between complexity and complication, right? You can have a watch that's complicated. And as a matter of fact, they talk about the complications of a watch, right? How many different mechanistic maneuvers can it run at once in order for it to be able to, but you can describe all of those. You can take them all apart, put them all together, design it so that it works that way. You can manufacture thousands of them in order for them to be able to work that way. You can't do that with a snail. We've never been able to, nor will we have even the slightest idea of how to begin to do it. So when we look at things like this, and then we talk about our own selves, right, as human beings, and we talk about the experiences that we have as human beings, like the experience of beauty and love, and the experience of art and awe, and for that matter, thought itself. And we haven't the slightest idea of how to even begin to explain these things. When I say explain, I don't simply mean, what is the meaning of these things, in terms of just to be able to describe them appropriately. We don't even have the terminology to be able to begin to describe them in toto, in a way that we would, A, be able to reproduce them, predict them, be able to experience them and understand them in their entirety. We just don't have the ability to do it. And what we try to do is we try to reduce it in order to be able to get a grasp on it. So the reason why I think it's important for us to be able to recognize these realities is because we have become very much a deductive culture. We have become very much a culture that lives in deductive reasoning. And it makes us comfortable because, of course, there's hubris in it. Naturally, when I know the answer of something emphatically, I can prove it emphatically. I get to an ironclad conclusion. There's hubris in that. I know what I'm doing. I understand my world. There's tremendous uncertainty, and for that matter, humility in trying to explain a fly, if we're honest with ourselves. There's a tremendous humility and uncertainty in trying to explain consciousness. We just have no idea. And I want to come back to that because there is something about the hubris in reason that enchants us, and it gets us very, very excited about it. So I'm going to say here one of the reasons why I wanted to present this to the Chabura. People talk about, we know how much the Rambam is, kind of the North Star for us in our Chabura, and that's something that I set very strongly, as kind of a director of the Bet Midrash. Everybody who knows me and knows my Torah recognizes the Rambam is my North Star. And one of the reasons why Harambam is my North Star, one of the reasons, is because he is a reason-based thinker. He's a rational man, right? So he does not lose himself in his faith, so to speak, in flights of imagination, yeah, or conjecture, for that matter. And so it's very important. And yet, at the same time, there are people who misunderstand Harambam and think that he would scoff at anything that is not reasonable. Yeah. Consciousness is entirely unreasonable. A fly, and I'm going to use, I just keep coming back to it because the example that I gave is entirely unreasonable. We frankly have absolutely no understanding of how it is that it works, nor any other life form on this planet how it works. We understand some basic mechanisms, but for goodness sakes, we can't explain it. We don't know how we went from nothing to that. That's a major problem. I'm going to read for you. This, by the way, is a book that I very, very highly recommend. This is written by the philosopher Thomas Nagel, called Mind and Cosmos: Why the Materialist Neo-Darwinian Conception of Nature is Almost Certainly False. I highly recommend the book. But one of the things that and the premise of the entire book is simply this. His point in dismissing the neo-Darwinian description of the conception of nature is that it doesn't account for consciousness. It looks at consciousness as a byproduct of evolution. That is a strange outcome of survival of the fittest. And his entire point is you cannot take something as central and powerful as consciousness and simply say it's an odd byproduct and say that you've got an appropriate description of the nature of reality and its development. You're missing a key component of the entire system. And so he writes here, if I can find it. Yeah. He says, the argument from the failure of psychophysical reductionism is a philosophical one, but I believe there are independent empirical reasons to be skeptical about the truth of reductionism in biology. Physicochemical reductionism in biology is the orthodox view, right? Meaning we can explain everything by its physical and chemical components, right? And understand them. And whatever else is that comes from, we just don't have all the information yet, but it's definitely all based in physiochemical core. It's the orthodox view. And any resistance to it is regarded as not only scientifically, but politically incorrect. But for a long time, he says, I found the materialist account of how we and our fellow organisms came to exist hard to believe, including the standard version of how the evolutionary process works. The more details we learn about the chemical basis of life and the intricacy of the genetic code, the more unbelievable the standard historical account becomes. This is just the opinion of a layman who reads widely in the literature that explains contemporary science to the non-specialist. Perhaps that literature presents the situation with a simplicity and confidence that does not reflect the most sophisticated scientific thought in these areas, but it seems to me that as it is usually presented, the current orthodoxy about the cosmic order is the product of governing assumptions that are unsupported, and that it flies in the face of common sense. So that's the opening. I'm simply putting that out. Why? Because basically what he's saying is that it's not accounting for the robust reality and complexity that we face. So that's one thing that a book that I would suggest, for people to read. But there's something about recognizing that there is a different way of looking at things, right? So in the simplest sense, inductive reasoning is certainly one, in which I observe the world, I recognize certain realities as manifest, and I have to theorize what is actually going on in reality. Now, the problem with this is that it is always a question of probability in this sense, not certainty. So to give a very, very basic example, let's say I have a pouch full of coins, and I put my hand into the pouch and I pull out a coin and it's a penny. And I do it again and I pull out a coin and it's a penny. And I do it again and I pull out a coin and it's a penny. And I do that again 7 more times, right? 10 times I've reached my hand into this pouch and pull out pennies. It is plausible, maybe even probable, for me to say, I'm holding a pouch of pennies. Now, is that absolute? No. Is it certain? No. But it's a plausible and indeed even a probable conclusion to come to. There are some, now you'll say, well, that's not the best way to look at it. I mean, just look inside the bag. That's fine. The point is, however, that there are certain situations in which we cannot look inside the bag. We do not have enough information that is the equivalent of looking inside the bag. And to disregard the real components that are there in order to be able to get some element of certainty is a failure. It's selling reality short, and to a certain degree, a mark of hubris. In other words, there are certain things in reality that we simply do not have all of the information for, and that the only way for us to know anything about it is through inductive reasoning and theory that is well-found and hopefully rigorous, but nonetheless probabilistic and statistical for that matter. Like the pennies being pulled from the bag. And I'm using a very basic example here so that we can get our heads around it. But of course, when I'm looking at something like consciousness, or like a fly, for that matter, I have no choice, if I am being intellectually honest, and indeed reason-based, to be able to admit to the fact that there is elements here that I'm blind to. And that all I know is that I am experiencing something that is undeniable, that human beings across the globe experience in tandem, that is undeniable, and yet we have no explanation for it. And all we can do is inductively describe it and give some element of reality to it. And that is not cheap. That is not something that is small. As a matter of fact, that is something that, if we are honest, is rooted in humility. So my dear friend, Mark Halperin, the author, another book that I recommend to you, only because it holds his essay in it, but I'm not recommending the entirety of the book, is this book called New Threats to Freedom. And my friend Mark Halperin, brilliant author, wonderful thinker, great man all around, wrote this beautiful line, and I just like the way that he says it. He says, faith is not hostile to reason, but reason is insulted when its careless practitioners fail to recognize its limitations. Some believe quite religiously that its past achievements being a guide, science will explain creation, infinity, time, consciousness, art, and love. Past returns, however, are no guide in a terrain of infinite false summits. Mapping the genome does not explain life or prove that we are only mechanisms. All right, so he wrote an entire essay in that vein, and I think it's very, very important to be able to kind of, if you want to wrap your head around these kinds of things, to read it. He does so and articulates it very eloquently. So what kind of things do we need to recognize that reason simply doesn't work for? Well, things that are metaphysical. And what I mean by that are not things necessarily that are spiritual, but metaphysical, exactly what it sounds like, right? They are not purely physical. There's something meta about them. Thought is metaphysical. Consciousness is metaphysical. Now, some people say, well, I mean, it's all in the firing of the neurons, right? But currently, at the very least, it is metaphysical. Why? Because we have absolutely no idea how on earth we go from neurons to consciousness. In the same way, we have absolutely no idea how we go from inanimate matter to life. No idea. These are things that lie in the realm of metaphysics, and that they bring to us properties that, frankly, are inexplicable. Certainly not using deductive reasoning. So how do we deal with these things? We deal with these things not through flights of fancy and pure imagination, in where I simply throw conjectures forward to try and fill the gaps of what it is that I do not know. That is not what we're talking about. And that, by the way, is the reason why people have held on with dear life to reason and deductive reason. Why? Because there's a fear that if I'm not holding on with all my life to deductive reasoning, I am going to have to be exposed to imaginary nonsense. And the truth of the matter is, religion is guilty of this, has been guilty of this for generations. And it is therefore, in the Western world, in its current status, collapsing under the weight of its own lies. And yet, there is an element, however small and bubbling, of a resurgence or a re-interest or a new familiarity with religious thought. Why? Because there's still a recognition that reason is bankrupt when it comes to things that are more complex than it's capable of dealing with. And maybe, just maybe, the thought around or that has been engaged in by religious thinkers, and in our Bet Midrash, I'm only going to talk about ours, right? Meaning our Hachamim. And I would go so far as to say that our Hachamim, for all the generations of their presence and development, have been profoundly rigorous in their inductive reasoning. But the nature of their reasoning is inductive, not deductive. They are dealing, why? Because the realm of elements with which they deal are themselves of high complexity and metaphysics. So how do they deal with it? They deal with it in terms of Torah. They deal with it in terms of recognizing that there is an element here, there is an entire level of reality here that we cannot address using deductive reasoning, that we need to have inferences about, that we need intuition about, which is why when in the Gemara, when we want to talk about Maaseh Bereshit, for example, right, which again is not entirely scientific. How do I explain life? How do I explain creation ex nihilo? How do I explain how do I explain God and creation itself? Which is a problem that Aristotle, who is highly susceptible and inclined to deductive reasoning, could not get around. How you can't get from what we consider God to be an actual created earth, a created universe. Where is the causality in that? How am I supposed to explain that through causal mechanisms? Well, I can't. So I have to say they just always were. But when I am able to accept paradox, because I recognize that there are certain things that I simply cannot explain mechanistically or causally, that I simply cannot deduce and find ironclad truths to, nonetheless recognize are true in their very existence and my experience of them, I have to recognize that inferences are necessary. Intuition is necessary. So I was going to say, when we teach Maaseh Bereshit, which includes the entirety of Maaseh Bereshit and not just the scientific elements, I need to teach it to somebody that the Hachamim say is mevin midato. What does it mean he's mevin midato? He understands from his own awareness. It's essentially an intuition. It's a sense of the direction of where these things are going. It's a sense of the nature of these things, even though they are, for all intents and purposes, ineffable. Why? I don't have the terms with which to be able to describe them appropriately because I don't have a description of reality that I can properly assign to these things because they are beyond my reason-based grasp. So that's why you never ever speak about Maaseh Bereshit in anything more than what we call Rashi Perakim, right? Headings, category headings. I don't attempt to go into detail to explain Maaseh Bereshit. Why? Because I can't. Because I will always be selling it short if I go in to try and explain it in a way that is not proper. So another person that I'm going to suggest you pay a lot of attention to, and certainly look up online, I can put the link to all of his stuff, is Ian McGilchrist. Ian McGilchrist is an unbelievable thinker and much more eloquent than I am in being able to present these ideas, and also much more intelligent than I am in order to be able to present these ideas. And he says, and I recognize it as kind of a play on what Einstein said. So Einstein said everything should be made as simple as possible, but not simpler. Which simply is saying, right, you can reduce things to the level of their reality, but don't make them simpler than what they are in reality and sell them short. So Ian McGilchrist says everything should be made as clear as possible, but not clearer. Right? And that's essentially what he's saying. You do not teach Maaseh Bereshit explicitly. Why? You can't make it clearer than it actually is. And there are some things that are just not as clear as we would wish them to be. And so what you need in those situations are elements of intuition. And that is what Hachamim call mevin midato. You have to get it from your own mind. I can speak to you in broad terms about ideas. You need to fill in the gaps with your experience and understanding. And even with that, not be able to fully express and totally get what it is that you get. So when you are in love, and you have no doubt about the fact that you are, and you know what the experience is, you know what the realm of love is, good luck on being able to discuss it. So it's like Nassim Nicholas Taleb writes, and he has a small book called, although I'm not thrilled with him right now because he's not exactly the greatest friend of Israel at the moment, but nonetheless, a wise man. And he has a book called the Bed of Procrustes. And Procrustes was a little bit of an old legend where that was basically went that he was a sinister man, but an old Greek mythology that he would bring people into his home and feed them dinner and give them wonderful experience, and he would put them to bed. And of course, his bed was only one size, and it was quite short. And if people didn't fit in the bed, he would cut their feet off in order to be able to fit them into the bed, right? So that's the idea of having to fit ideas into what it is that I already know, or to say that I will only accept realities in the narrow focus that I'm able to perceive them, but I will not broaden my awareness in order to be able to hold them. And what he writes in this book is, if you want to annoy a poet, explain his poetry. Why does that annoy a poet? Because it reduces the poetry. It loses all of the wholeness and the robustness of what poetry is meant to be, which is why, by the way, Torah itself is called in its entirety a poem. Kitvu lechem et hashira hazot. Write this poem for yourselves. The entirety of Torah is essentially recognized as a poem. So, in recognizing this, right, I think that it's very important to see a few things. First is, I'm not dissing reason. I mean, for goodness sakes, it has brought us to such a great understanding of the mechanisms of our world that we are able to build technologies as a result of it, right? When we know how things work, we can build things to work in very specific ways. As a matter of fact, I mean, there's this wonderful area of production. It's called biomimicry, which I've spoken about a few times. Janine Benaya's wrote a great book called Biomimicry, and where we, in order to be able to produce solutions to problems, right, in the world, in physics, and ultimately, problems that we find in the world, we look to biology to see how biology has solved these similar or same problems. And the amazing thing is that biology always solves the problems in the most elegant way and the simplest way, because it finds the path of least resistance in order to be able to do it. It's very, very simple, not so complex all the time. And so we look to biology in order to be able to fill these things. These are very much mechanistic types of things, but they're only bits and pieces of what it is that we have in the entirety of reality. So look, I'm not dissing reason. And nor did the Rambam diss reason. To the contrary, he embraced it, loved it, and absolutely recognized its value. He called Aristotle one rung below Nivuah, one rung below prophecy. I mean, there was no one that used deductive reasoning as clearly and so beautifully as Aristotle. But nonetheless, it's limited in what it is able to bring us in terms of our understanding. And we have to recognize that. We have to recognize that, especially in terms of what it is that we're doing, right? So a lot of times, I want to go back to this question of hubris. A lot of times I find Rambamniks to be filled with hubris because they believe that they have all the answers. Even the reasons that Rambam gave for the mitzvot are probabilistic. They're inferences. They are all results of inductive reasoning. When I say mitzvot, I mean specifically the chukim. So Harambam writes in the Moreh Nevuchim in the third chelik, in Perek Vav, I read it to you. I'm sorry I don't have it on the screen for you, but I'll read it for you. He says, כמו שנחלקו אנשי העיון בין בעלי הדת, האם מעשיו יתעלה תוצאה של חוכמה או סתם רצון, right? Same way that the thinkers of our religion have questioned, right, whether, or religion in general, have questioned whether God is motivated by chokhmah, or it is just some spontaneous act of his, right? So is it determined by something? Is it a result or a cause of something? Or is it simply a spontaneous act? So too they have argued with regards to mitzvot. And some say that the mitzvot simply are arbitrary commands, and some say that there's an actual goal for the mitzvot. So Harambam is of the ilk that believes that HaKadosh Baruch Hu has a goal for his mitzvot, right? There's an aim, there's a reason, so to speak, right, for the mitzvot that he gives us. Some of the reasons are evident to us, some of the reasons are not. Why? Because some mitzvot are not sensible. Some of the mitzvot aren't reasonable. What do I mean by that? There's no clear reason as to why these mitzvot should be commanded. Why should I not wear wool and linen together? It's absurd. It's absurd. There's no reason that I can sense in that, and certainly no reason to be had in it, ostensibly on its surface. And no matter what anyone says, there is no deductive reason that a person can give for it, that's for sure. So what does Harambam do? Harambam says, look, this is coming from God, this is metaphysical. This has its roots in the metaphysical realm. And the only thing that we can do with metaphysics, essentially, is to use inductive reasoning. And that's all that the Rambam does. But what the Rambam recognizes is that this is probably the reason. He can't say more than that. There's nothing more that you can say in that capacity. You cannot say this is emphatically the reason of something that, for all intents and purposes, is metaphysical in nature. All you can say is this is probably the reason, right? From a statistical perspective or a probabilistic perspective. It's all we've got. So there is humility in that. Why? Because even Harambam, in presenting reasons for the mitzvot that are pretty good, right? I mean, not that Harambam needs me to say that. I don't want to sound like I'm arrogant when I'm talking against hubris. Chas v'shalom, it's not how I mean it, right? What I mean is that these are quite substantive reasons that Harambam gave. Quite substantive reasons. And nonetheless, they can be nothing more than working definitions. And not only can they be nothing more than working definitions, one might go so far as to say, although a determinist and a materialist will argue with me on this, one can also go so far as to say we will never know the emphatic reasons because they are by nature metaphysical. In the same way, again, a materialist would argue with me, in the same way, we will never be able to fully explain love or thought or God. We just don't have it. And these are the things that the Hachamim recognize as being in Shamayim. Like that's the way that they relate to the metaphysical. Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz. There are elements that are Shamayim oriented. Torah is Shamayim oriented, right? We say Torah min hashamayim. Torah comes from the Shamayim. It's talking to you about a reality that if you were coming from that level of being, you would see the world in the way that Torah describes it. And the fact that we do not see the world in the way Torah describes it is because we are married to reason. And that is an issue. So I was saying about Harambam, right? That Harambam, although he is a reason-based thinker, he does not commit the sin of using reason in areas that it has no business being. Nor should we. And that's why it irks me sometimes when I see some Rambamniks that have high levels of hubris. Because it's almost as though they recognize that there's all this rationalistic, reason-based understanding of the world, and as long as things fit into that nice little box, then we've got it. And if they start to bleed out of that box, or if they are in the periphery around that box, well, that's not for us. And then they scoff at it. And they laugh it away to make themselves feel better, because the way to be able to make a person feel better and negate reality is to be cynical about it. And the reason I'm giving this class is not only because I think it's a very important thing to keep in our minds if we're genuine thinkers today, but because if there's one element or thread that I seem to see running in some level, no matter how light, in our Bet Midrash, it's this. And it's wrong. And it is not equal, right? Being able to be open to metaphysical thought is not the same as marrying imaginative conjecture. There's a very big difference, right? One is rigorous, one is careful, one is constantly readdressed and re-examined, and the other is simply selfish. That's just what it is that I think and doesn't make any sense, and I'm going to just find whatever explanation I can find to attach to it that makes me look like more of a believer. Our job is not to become great believers. That's certainly not part of Judaism. It may be part of other religions, but not part of ours. And that is why the Talmud is so important to study. Why is the Talmud so important to study? Because think about what the Talmud is. The Talmud is a compendium of centuries and centuries of discussion, of metaphysical reasoning that is constantly and rigorously refined. And that is not something to sneeze at. By some of the greatest minds of all time. And that is very much in our hands. It's in our grasp. It's in our heritage. It is in our treasury as Jewish people. And it's something we should not be embarrassed to have, nor something that we should be embarrassed to study, nor something that we should be embarrassed to engage with. It is not the same as believing in unicorns and the tooth fairy. So I want to recognize, right, the man who gave us the Torah, right, Moshe Rabbeinu. What is the greatest praise of that man in the Torah? That he was the wisest man? No. That he was the most anav, that he was the man of greatest humility. And what that means is that he was a man who was never, ever arrogant in his need to be right and understand things. He was a man, as I've said many times, Anavan, Harambam actually writes this explicitly in the Perusha Mishnah and Siddur Zeraim. He says, Anava, humility, comes from the word ana, which means to be responsive. It's a question of responsiveness to reality. It's a question of an exploratory, awe-based engagement with reality. The knowledge that I simply do not have all the answers, and that if I don't understand how an organism works, or for that matter, what an organism is, I'm not going to reduce it to a machine. I'm not going to reduce it to a machine and start talking about it as though it is a machine. I will not do that. That was Moshe Rabbeinu. The greatest praise of Moshe is Ve'aish Moshe anav me'od mikol ha'adam asher al pnei adama. And the man Moses, not the angel Moses, the man Moses, was the most humble man upon the face of the earth. And of course, it's exacerbated or kind of highlighted by the fact that we believe that who wrote that line? Well, he did. He was just writing down a real point. Reason helps us. It does. It helps us in our grounding of reality, in our basic building blocks of reality. But as my friend Mark Halpern said, it is insulted when it is used to address things that it has no business addressing. And with that, I want to close. I will have, so I've recommended a few things here. I recommended New Threats to Freedom, that's edited by Adam Bellow. I recommended Mind and Cosmos, that was written by Thomas Nagel. I recommended The Bed of Procrustes, that was written by Taleb. Did you get in the link? Did you get in Ian McGilchrist? You put in his website? He has a website of his own. Did you put that in?
I put in his Wikipedia.
No. We don't want his Wikipedia. We don't want it. I'll tell you. We want this. I'll put it in myself. All right. Where are we? Chat. There you go. Here. That. So you have plenty to read, plenty to explore in order to be able to kind of fill all of this in. Really, what I'm presenting here is really just the tip of the iceberg and just kind of the shape, like I said, of these things. But I wish everyone a good break and a recharge and time to think on your own, right? So there's one thing about sitting and learning and hearing and lectures and so on, and then there's time to kind of digest and think on your own, and that's what this time is for. And I can't close without prayer, and that HaKadosh Baruch Hu should bless Am Yisrael and should bless the land of Israel and should bless our people in shalom and protect us and indeed bring shalom to the entire world. It certainly feels like it's time, and that the suffering should be taken away and reduced, and that everybody should see bracha in their learning and in their growth and their achievements and their love and fear of HaKadosh Baruch Hu and in their understanding of his world. And I hope and pray that we should, as I said at the beginning, only strength to strength in the Chabura and all that it's involved and all of its Talmidim and all the people that participate. Amen. Good night.
Thank you so much.